All right, so this video is going to go over what I did to print and paint this d20 wall art. This wall art is available at Printables. If you go here and just search for d20 wall art, it'll pull right up. It's this first design here. And the files I used when you go into the file section are the V2 files. These are split out. It downloads as a single object for each tile, but the base plate, the background insert, and the numbers are separate. So once you import this STL into your slicer, you can split that up, and it makes it way easier to paint the background, paint the numbers different color, paint the base plate. And I scaled this to 75%, which I think made it roughly 15 inches across. It's quite a bit bigger. If you go 100%, I think it's maybe 20 inches across, but it makes for some really cool wall art. I believe the original designer intended for this to be mounted with like command strips or some kind of double-sided tape. It's pretty cool. It floats on your wall, so to speak. I actually mounted mine on plexiglass. I was gifting it to a friend so they could hang it up on the wall. So again, download those V2 files from this Printables from the Printables website. And this is the final product. What I did was I painted this back with a dark metallic gray, and I'll get into this in detail, but this is kind of a overview. I used 5 different colors in a cup, and I used a sponge to splotch on these colors to kind of get this mixed look. And then I sprayed these with the numbers separately with a pearlized white acrylic paint. This is all acrylic paint you can get from like a hobby store like Michael's. And then I mounted it on this plexiglass so my friend can hang it on their wall. So I'm going to go over the build process here. So the first thing I did, of course, is print all these pieces out. I used a black matte PLA, and these are the inserts here that go on the back. I didn't do any sanding to those, but the numbers and the base plates, now is the time to get these cleaned up. So any under extrusion or holes or gaps or whatever you want to fill with a little bit of putty at this point. After each of these came off my print bed, I did use a pencil, mechanical pencil on the back of these letter numbers to note which plate they went with, because some of these ones are similar. That you could probably eyeball it, but I just wanted to err on the side of caution and make sure I got that right. There's a slight variation between the ones that you want to pay attention to when you're putting these down. And then also these plates here, they only go in the triangles. It doesn't matter. Well, actually, it does. Or actually, no, it doesn't. There's 2 different sizes here, and then there's the main one in the middle. But these plates on the side do flip one way or the other. So make sure when you paint these, you paint the side that was facing up when you printed, and then you won't have a problem. And then to sand it, I have a piece of tile I got from our Lowe's or Home Depot for a couple bucks, but it's a nice flat surface to sand on to make sure you get a true surface. So that made it a lot easier as well to get these all trued up. After those were done, I went ahead and did a number of layers of primer filler, and I used a few different colors of paint I had on hand, just cans I had left over. I was going through and would prime and paint. And you don't have to wait till this stuff is like cured up after a couple hours. You can actually sand it lightly within, I don't know, a half hour. If you actually have a fan blowing on it, it removes enough of the solvents from the paint that it's set up enough that you can make some light sand. You can make some light passes on sandpaper to flatten out those surfaces. So once that was done, I got to putting the color on, and I used again, I'm using our acrylic paints from Michael's. These are like small 2-ounce bottles. They're like a couple bucks each, and I cut it 50% with airbrush medium, and you can cut it with water, but the problem with that is you dilute the paint, and so some of the pigments can fall out of the paint. They're not suspended. So if you use an airbrush medium, which is like it's like a clear additive you put to the paint to cut it, it'll help keep those pigments suspended so you get an even coat. I'm not a pro. I saw that tip and I stuck with it since I've been cutting paint for spraying, and it's worked well for me. If you can cut it with water and it works well for you, then keep going. But I took that tip and figured I'd spend a few bucks on the medium, cut it with that, and get good results and not worry about it. I did buy a Lazy Susan a while back. You can get these for a couple bucks off of eBay or Amazon, and I cut a couple pieces of wood to make a rotational piece for painting. And for stuff like this, it was perfect because you'd spray this side, spray the inside here, and then rotate it 120 degrees roughly, split a triangle by 3, and then spray those other surfaces. So it helps you spray those evenly. And then also having good light is really important to make sure that you're getting everything shot correctly. And that's the result of getting those base plate pieces painted. Then I did the numbers. These were so lightweight that my airbrush was pushing them around the board, so I had to come up from about 2 feet high to about 18 inches high and just spritz down some paint to paint these. And it took a little bit longer, but finished product turned out nice. And once I got that first coat on, these were kind of lightly stuck in place to the back to this board here, so I was able to kind of walk around and shoot it with paint. It didn't really result in an issue on my final product, but sometimes when there's a little bit of paint down, your object will stick to it. I used that to my advantage, and then my airbrush wasn't pushing them around as easily, and I was able to spray those. And then for this background, you can print this a different color if you want these inserts, but I wanted to do something with paint, which again, with these being removed or separate from the base, it made it way easier to do the paint work without having to work around the letters, work around the bases, and put that color down without making a mess. And with this splotching, the sponging technique, if you decide to go that route, practice on some cardboard, getting your technique down so when you do your pieces, it comes out consistent. It's not, it's not an exact science, this method. So you're mixing, you put the 5 different colors in a cup and you have like the dots of paint or the splotches of paint separate. You don't mix them up, but you put your sponge down on top of that. So your sponge has 5 different dots of color, and then start dabbing it onto the cardboard and you'll see the effect. And then just go back and forth. You'll figure it out. If you mess up on a piece, you can always just take a cloth and wipe it down because that paint's still wet. This is separate when you're doing the work on it. So you have that kind of flexibility to wipe it off real quick and then reset and paint it over again to get the effect you want. But I was pretty stoked with how that broke up that back surface and provided contrast between the base plate and the numbers. The numbers were glued in place with epoxy, and what I did was stare and compare with the printables site. And when you use that epoxy, just put small drops on the number itself and kind of hold it in place and figure out where you're going to go with it and kind of memorize that. Go back, put your glue on, and then put it in place. The epoxy goes a long way when you put it in place. It'll squish out. I don't know why I'm going here because I have my own pictures here. I can jump to the end here. I was going to show you real quick. You can see this little bits of shiny here. It's not totally apparent, but once your numbers set up, after depending on if you have 15 or 30 minute epoxy, come back later with a Q-tip, maybe half an hour later, and gently wipe these areas, and you get a lot of that removed because it does kind of stick out as a glossy bit. And you want these numbers looking clean the way they're mounted there. So that's it on the background surface painting. Gluing your numbers in place. Again, just go back to the printable site and you have a visual aid there to see where those numbers go, and you'll get it taken care of. Just take your time. The designer did print these awesome alignment pieces, and they allow you to line everything up nicely. And I mounted this again on plexiglass. So what I did is I put all the pieces in place as if they would be on the surface. I put the plexiglass over it. I taped off where I wanted to cut. I wanted to have these kind of perpendicular lines here and here when this was behind it to make it look like it floated on the wall, but also just have some clean lines. And then I used a jigsaw to cut it out. You can use a metal blade. It does get warm after a while, and these little chips don't fly away. They start melting and gathering. So wait for your blade to cool and then continue cutting. But it turned out pretty good. That's the finished result. There, I basically put this over it again, and then I used painter's tape to mark where the center triangle would go. And then I glued that center triangle into place because everything was lining up off of that. So once that's glued in place, I used super glue on here. I used epoxy on the rest. The epoxy gives you a little time to work with it. I highly recommend when you put your epoxy in place, mark where you're gonna put your epoxy drops, and then instead of putting the epoxy right on this glossy acrylic, take a little bit of sandpaper and just etch those spots, and that's going to give that epoxy something decent to bite into. You don't want to sand all the way out here where it's going to be clear and you're going to see it. You want to sand where it's going to be hidden, but that'll give that epoxy a better chance to grip the acrylic. I didn't do that on this, and one of my tiles popped off. I had to come back and walk around the back with some super glue in spots where you couldn't see it from the front, and then I had to put a fan on it because super glue has a tendency to haze. But if you could because of the fumes coming off of it when it dries, but if you actually put a fan on it, you can get some pretty clean results with super glue because it blows those fumes away. It's not 100%, but it's a pretty good hack in that scenario if you're trying to keep the haze off of your stuff. Let's see here. So that's the centerpiece, how to line that up and glue your parts in. Use these inserts. These are the way I put these in. Oh, one last point is depending on how long your epoxy takes to set up. I had 30-minute epoxy. After about a half hour, I went back and double-checked positions, or maybe 15 minutes. And then epoxy allows you to do some minor adjustments. Super glue, once it's set up, that's it. It's set up. You're not shifting stuff around. Epoxy glue kind of gets a little gummy before it fully sets up, so you can shift stuff around. And I would come back and make sure when I had this on the mounting plate that these were tight into these inserts. These inserts will lift straight up and off, no problem when you're done. Just lift them straight up, because if you try to lift it up on one edge, it's going to kind of pry into there, and it's pretty locked in there, but it'll come straight out, no problem, once your piece, this whole thing is set up. Once I got those set up in place, I put painter's tape on these to hold their position, and then I glued the letters into place. So you can see there's little blobs here, and we can always see our own errors worse than anybody else. And so I walked around with a Q-tip and got those little blobs of epoxy that squished out for a cleaner finish. You can see that's that shininess I pointed out. You just kind of eyeball it. In the end, you're the one that's going to notice it the most. But it's one last little detail. You're putting all this work into it, so just get those details knocked out. And then I was giving this to a friend for their birthday, and so I didn't want to hand them something, take something fragile to the party and then hand them something and say, all right, don't break it. So I made this carrier. It's just a piece of really thin plywood. I took some cardboard and put some spray adhesive between some sheets, glued them together, and cut them with my table saw, and just glued these on. Again, I sprayed the back of these with spray adhesive, put them in place so this thing didn't shift around. Then I made a flap that went over it. This paint was still curing slightly the day of. I wrapped this up, so I put wax paper on the back of this flap. Wax paper is pretty nice. Glue doesn't stick to it, paint doesn't stick to it, and so I wanted to make sure this cardboard didn't stick to this paint if it was slightly tacky. So I put some wax paper on it. I'm pretty sure it was cured up, but just erred on the side of the caution after all that work. And then put this flap on there that's good for transporting it. On the back, I did put this mounting clip. You can get these at Home Depot or hardware stores. I did, once I lined it up, you want to make sure this doesn't sit over this clear spot here. You want it on the back side, the edges of the triangle. And I used a blowtorch. You could use a lighter too on a nail just to melt some pilot holes, and then I drilled those out. Be very careful, because if you put too much pressure, you can crack this. You don't want to do it at this stage. You've done all this awesome work. Create those holes. I put a little bit of wood glue in there, so when the screws went in there, they would be set up a little more, just to make sure that they stayed in there. But I used a hole slightly smaller than these M10 screws, and just let them self-thread in there. But that's pretty solid. That's going to hold. Yep. And so that's the final result. I was pretty stoked with it. It was a gift for a friend. They were happy with it, and I hope this video, if you're pondering painting it and doing this creation, again, shout out to the designer. They took the time to split those pieces out, which made this way easier to get a nice clean result. So I hope this helps.